The monsoon rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of Barracks 7 like 1,000 angry drums. Inside, beneath the suffocating humidity of the Philippine jungle, Captain James Mac McAllister pressed his ear against a crude wooden post, listening, not to the storm outside, but to something far more dangerous. The faint crackle of static electricity, the ghost of a signal that shouldn't exist. It was August 1944. The war in the Pacific had turned, though the men imprisoned in Camp Hawthorne didn't know it yet. They knew only the rhythm of captivity, the daily roll calls, the meager rice rations, the brutal heat, and the watchful eyes of their Japanese captors. Communication with the outside world had been severed for 18 months. No letters, no news, no hope, except for what could be stolen from scraps. Mac pulled back from the post, his gaunt face breaking into the first genuine smile in months. Behind him, 3 other men watched with hollow eyes that suddenly flickered with something they'd almost forgotten. Possibility. In the corner of the barracks, hidden beneath a loose floorboard and wrapped in oil-stained canvas, lay their impossible creation, a radio receiver built from stolen wire, salvaged capacitors, and desperation. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. Captain James McAllister had been an electrical engineer in civilian life, working for RCA in Camden, New Jersey. That previous existence felt like a dream now, or perhaps this was the nightmare. He'd been captured in early 1943 during the fall of Bataan, surviving the death march through sheer luck and the stubborn refusal to die that kept many Americans breathing when their bodies said otherwise. Barracks 7 housed 42 POWs, but only 4 knew about the radio project. Mac had selected them carefully over months of observation. There was Lieutenant Robert Bob Hartley, a former ham radio operator from Iowa who could read Morse code in his sleep. Sergeant Eddie Nakamura, a Nisei soldier whose Japanese language skills were invaluable, but made him suspect to both sides. And Private First Class Tommy O'Brien, a 19-year-old kid from Boston with fingers nimble enough to pick locks and steal components without getting caught. Camp Hawthorne sat in the mountains northeast of Manila, a repurposed logging camp transformed into a prison for Allied officers and specialists. The Japanese command structure was rigid but predictable. Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto ran the camp with bureaucratic precision, more concerned with maintaining order than anticipating escape attempts. His guards were a mix of veterans and conscripts, some brutal, others merely indifferent. The camp's relative isolation was both advantage and curse, hard to escape from but also less scrutinized by higher command. The idea for the radio had come 3 months earlier, during one of the work details. POWs were regularly assigned to repair duty around the camp, fixing fences, maintaining the generator shed, clearing jungle growth. It was during a generator repair that Mac noticed something. The Japanese guards treated machinery with superstitious respect. They understood maintenance but not theory. They could follow procedures but couldn't improvise. They think in patterns, Mac had whispered to Bob one night. If we can stay inside their pattern, they won't see what's right in front of them. The camp's vulnerability lay in its very order. Tools were counted but not examined. Scrap metal was collected but not inventoried. The Japanese assumed control was the same as security. They were wrong. Mac began mapping the camp's electrical system, memorizing patrol routes, identifying which guards were observant and which were lazy. Slowly, methodically, he built a picture of possibility. They couldn't fight their way out, but maybe, just maybe, they could think their way out. The radio began as an act of defiance more than strategy. In captivity, the mind either surrendered or fought, and Mac refused to let his engineering knowledge rust away. He started sketching circuits in the dirt during exercise periods, erasing them before guards noticed. Bob contributed memories of radio theory from his amateur operator days. Eddie translated overheard Japanese conversations, piecing together information about the war's progress or lack thereof. The first component came from Tommy's light fingers during a work detail at the motor pool. A handful of copper wire, thin as thread, stolen while a guard argued with a mechanic about a broken truck. That night, Tommy passed it to Mac during the rice distribution. The wire coiled inside a ball of sticky rice. Mac nearly laughed at the absurdity and the genius. "It's a start," Mac said, hiding the wire in his mattress straw. The psychological toll of imprisonment showed differently in each man. Bob had become quieter, more withdrawn, his mind escaping to memories of his farm and his wife, Mary. Eddie carried the double burden of his heritage, never quite trusted by fellow POWs. always suspected by Japanese guards who saw him as a traitor to his ancestral homeland. Tommy dealt with captivity through humor, cracking jokes even when his ribs showed through his skin, maintaining a facade of youth that was rapidly crumbling. Mac became their anchor. He set a routine. Each day they'd identify one component they needed. Each week, they'd attempt one theft. Patience was survival. Rushing was death. The Japanese guards had their own hierarchy of cruelty. Sergeant Ishida was a sadist who enjoyed random beatings. Corporal Sato was professional but fair. He followed orders but didn't create suffering. Private Tanaka was young, barely older than Tommy, visibly uncomfortable with his role as captor. Mac studied them like specimens, learning which guards could be distracted, which were meticulous, which were simply going through the motions of a war they might be losing. By June 1944, they had accumulated a small cache, wire of various gauges, capacitors salvaged from broken radios in the camp office, resistors pulled from damaged equipment, a vacuum tube stolen during a rare visit from a Japanese radio technician. Each piece was hidden in different locations, under floorboards inside hollowed-out posts, buried in the latrine's drainage area. The question was no longer whether they could build a radio. It was whether they could build one before their luck ran out. The first major setback came on a sweltering July morning. Colonel Yamamoto announced a surprise inspection, not the routine daily count, but a full barracks search. Mac felt his stomach drop. They had components hidden in 6 different locations throughout Barracks 7. If even one was discovered, they'd face execution. "Stay calm," Mac whispered to Bob as guards began moving through the barracks, upending mattresses and probing walls. "They're looking for weapons, not electronics." The assumption proved correct, but barely. Sergeant Ishida jabbed his bayonet into the floorboards near one of their primary hiding spots, missing the concealed vacuum tube by inches. Tommy watched with forced casualness, his face and mask of bored indifference, while his heart hammered against his ribs. The inspection lasted 2 hours. The Japanese found a homemade knife, not theirs, in another prisoner's belongings. The man was dragged outside. The sounds that followed made everyone flinch, but they served a purpose. While Ishida was distracted with brutality, Eddie used the commotion to relocate their most sensitive components to a new hiding place inside a hollowed-out Bible. "We got lucky," Bob said that night, his voice shaking. "We can't keep doing this. If they find it, we're dead anyway," Mac interrupted. "We're dead if we stay here long enough. Disease, starvation, execution when the war turns worse for them. Take your pick. This radio is our only chance." But the close call forced a strategic shift. Mac realized they needed to accelerate the timeline. The war was clearly progressing. Occasional snippets of overheard Japanese conversations suggested Allied advances. If liberation came before they could use the radio, fine. But if the Japanese decided to liquidate prisoners before retreating, a common practice they'd heard about from other camps, they needed an escape plan ready. That night, Mac made a decision that changed everything. They wouldn't just build a receiver to gather intelligence. They'd build a transmitter too, a way to contact Allied forces directly, coordinate an escape with outside support, or at minimum, transmit their location before making a break for the jungle. It was ambitious to the point of suicidal. Transmitters required more power, more components, more risk of detection. But Mac had learned something in captivity. Half measures were just slow ways to die. If they were going to risk everything, they might as well risk it for something that mattered. The psychological weight of the decision settled over the 4 conspirators like a physical burden. Building a receiver was one thing, passive, defensive, relatively low risk. A transmitter was an aggressive act, an electronic declaration of war against their captors. If caught, they wouldn't just be punished. They'd provide the Japanese with evidence of espionage, justifying retaliation against all POWs. Bob struggled with the moral calculus. "We're putting everyone at risk," he argued during a whispered conversation in the latrine, the only place they could talk with relative privacy. "If this goes wrong, 42 men in this barracks," Mac interrupted, keeping his voice low. "Maybe 300 in the whole camp. How many do you think will survive if we just wait? We're losing guys to dysentery, malaria, beriberi every week. The Japanese are stretching their supply lines thin. Our rations are already getting smaller. What happens when they can't feed us at all?" Eddie added his perspective, his voice bitter with personal experience. "I've been listening to the guards. They're scared. The Americans are island hopping closer. Some of the soldiers talk about final solutions if withdrawal orders come. You understand what that means? Tommy, leaning against the wall, tried to inject his usual humor, but it came out hollow. So we're damned if we do, damned if we don't. At least if we do something, we're choosing how we go out. The decision to proceed was never formally voted on. It simply evolved through exhausted acceptance. They were engineers and soldiers, trained to solve problems. Inaction wasn't in their nature, even when action was terrifying. Mac assigned new roles. Eddie would focus on intelligence gathering, translating every scrap of Japanese conversation he could overhear, mapping guard rotations down to the minute. Bob would refine their technical knowledge, mentally working through circuit designs that might create a functional transmitter with their limited components. Tommy would continue procurement operations, getting bolder with his thefts as the deadline compressed. Mac took on the most dangerous role, reconnaissance beyond the camp perimeter. During work details in the surrounding jungle, he began noting geographical features, possible escape routes, water sources, and most critically, the location of the nearest Japanese military installations. A transmission would be worthless if they didn't know where Allied forces might be listening. The radio had evolved from hope to strategy. Now it needed to become reality. The subterfuge expanded in unexpected ways. In late July, a new prisoner arrived at Camp Hawthorne, Lieutenant Commander David Chen, a Navy intelligence officer who'd been captured during a failed reconnaissance mission near Leyte Gulf. Chen was different from the typical POW, alert, calculating, and surprisingly well-fed for someone supposedly captured weeks earlier. Mac's instincts prickled. He's asking too many questions, he told the others. Wants to know about camp routines, guard patterns, who the leaders are. Maybe he's planning his own escape, Tommy suggested. Or maybe he's a plant, Eddie countered. The Japanese have used collaborators before. Promise better treatment. Threaten worse torture. Plenty of ways to turn someone. They watched Chen carefully. He integrated into camp life smoothly. Too smoothly. He had information about the war's progress that seemed oddly specific. MacArthur's return to the Philippines, B-29 raids on Japan, submarine victories in the Pacific. Where would a recently captured prisoner get such detailed intelligence? Mac made a calculated decision. A test. During a casual conversation, he dropped false information about a supposed tunnel being dug from Barracks 3. If Chen was reporting to the Japanese, there would be a search. 3 days later, guards tore apart Barracks 3 looking for a non-existent tunnel. He's compromised, Bob said flatly. Question is whether he's doing it willingly or under duress. Eddie offered to confront Chen directly, use his Japanese language skills to eavesdrop on any private conversations between Chen and the guards. But Mac had a different idea. We don't confront him. We use him. Feed him information that serves our purposes. The radio project suddenly had a counterintelligence dimension. They began carefully crafting a narrative around Chen, false complaints about guard brutality in different sectors, imagined plans for mass resistance that would never materialize, rumors about American submarines off the coast waiting for signals. Some of it was misdirection. Some was psychological warfare, designed to make the Japanese guards more paranoid and therefore more predictable in their reactions. And buried within the noise was their real operation, hidden in plain sight because Chen and his handlers were looking in all the wrong directions. It was a dangerous game. Every interaction with Chen required maintaining multiple layers of deception, but it taught them something valuable. The Japanese command structure relied heavily on informants because they didn't truly understand their prisoners. That gap, between surveillance and comprehension, was where escape lived. August brought the worst heat anyone could remember, and with it death came more frequently to Camp Hawthorne. Corporal Martinez died of malaria despite Mac's best efforts to treat him with stolen quinine. Private Stevens succumbed to dysentery, his body too weakened to fight the infection. Each death diminished the camp not just in numbers but in spirit. Mac performed the impossible calculus that haunted every POW leader. How many lives was freedom worth? If their escape attempt failed and the Japanese retaliated, men who might have survived captivity would die because of his decision. But if they succeeded and brought Allied forces back, hundreds might be saved. Bob wrestled with different demons. His wife Mary's last letter, received before capture, mentioned she was pregnant. Their child would be over a year old now. A son or daughter he'd never met, might never meet. Each day in captivity was a day stolen from that future. The radio represented more than escape. It was a lifeline to a life interrupted. a family waiting, a world beyond barbed wire and brutality. Eddie's struggle was identity itself. Fellow POWs trusted him, but never quite fully. His face was the enemy's face, despite his uniform and his suffering being identical to theirs. Japanese guards despised him as a race traitor, a man who'd abandoned his proper allegiance. The radio project gave him purpose beyond survival, a way to prove his loyalty not through words, but through action that might save American lives. Tommy, the youngest, showed cracks in his facade of youthful invincibility. One night, Mac found him crying silently in the darkness, homesickness and fear finally overwhelming his defensive humor. "I'm scared, Captain," Tommy whispered. "Not of dying. I've made peace with that. I'm scared I'll die before I do something that matters." Mac put a hand on the kid's shoulder. "You've already mattered, Tommy. Every component you've stolen, every risk you've taken, you've kept hope alive for all of us. That matters more than you know." These moments of vulnerability, shared in darkness, whispered between men who'd become brothers through shared suffering, forged the emotional steel necessary for what came next. They weren't just building a radio anymore. They were building trust, building courage, building the psychological foundation for an escape that would require perfect coordination and unwavering commitment. The technical challenges were solvable. The human ones were what kept Mac awake at night. September brought the breakthrough they'd been desperately seeking. During a work detail at the camp's administrative building, Tommy made his most audacious theft yet, a complete radio chassis from Colonel Yamamoto's personal office. The colonel had confiscated it from a Filipino family months earlier and kept it as a trophy. It was broken, non-functional, but to Mac's trained eye, it was a treasure trove of components they couldn't fabricate on their own. The risk had been extraordinary. Tommy had created a distraction by accidentally knocking over a filing cabinet, then grabbed the radio while guards scrambled to restore order. He'd hidden it in a sanitation bucket, covered it with waste, and carried it right past the front gate. The guards hadn't even looked twice. "Kid's either brilliant or insane," Bob muttered as they examined the prize that night. "Maybe both." Mac carefully dissected the radio, cataloging each component. They now had everything they needed: tubes, capacitors, resistors, a proper transformer, even crystal elements that could be repurposed for frequency control. The technical barriers had just collapsed, but timing became critical. Eddie's intelligence gathering had revealed something alarming. The Japanese were planning to relocate prisoners in October, splitting the camp's population between different facilities. The official reason was reorganization, but Eddie's translation of a careless conversation between guards suggested something darker: liquidation of prisoners deemed non-essential before American forces advanced further north. "We have 3 weeks," Mac told the group. "Maybe 4 if we're lucky. After that, we're scattered or dead." The accelerated timeline meant taking bigger risks. They began assembling the radio inside the hollow post in Barracks 7, working in 30-minute increments during the darkest part of night, when guards were least attentive. Bob's knowledge of radio theory combined with Mac's engineering expertise. Eddie stood watch, ready to signal if guards approached. Tommy prepared their backup plan, forged tools, hidden supplies, an escape route through the fence perimeter he'd been gradually weakening over months. The radio took shape, receiver circuit first, carefully tested with a makeshift antenna wire that could be quickly hidden. The first time they powered it up using a stolen battery, nothing happened. Mac's heart sank. Then Bob adjusted a connection, and suddenly, faintly, impossibly, they heard static, then voices, then music. American voices, American music. It was the BBC World Service, broadcast for Allied forces in the Pacific. They'd done it. Against every odd, they'd built a working radio receiver from absolute scraps. The intelligence they gathered from the radio transformed everything. The war news was better than they'd dared hope. MacArthur had indeed returned to the Philippines, landing at Leyte in October. Wait, October? Mac checked the date they'd scratched on the barracks wall. It was September 28th. The invasion was imminent, possibly already underway. "The guards don't know yet," Eddie reported after eavesdropping on Japanese communications. "Their radio equipment is barely functional. They're getting orders by courier, sometimes days late." This information gap represented both opportunity and urgency. If Allied forces were landing at Leyte, only a few hundred kilometers south, Japanese forces would be in chaos, falling back, potentially executing prisoners they couldn't transport. The window for escape was narrowing faster than they'd anticipated. Mac made the critical decision. They would transmit. One burst transmission, giving their coordinates and POW count, then destroy the radio and run. No time for elaborate planning, no contingency for failure. The Americans were close enough that someone might be listening. That had to be enough, but they needed additional help, and it came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Commander Chen, the suspected collaborator they'd been feeding disinformation, approached Mac privately during exercise period. "I know what you're doing," Chen said quietly. "The radio. I've known for 2 weeks." Mac's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're—" "Stop. I'm Navy intelligence, Captain. I was ordered to infiltrate this camp, assess prisoner conditions, identify potential resistance leaders. I've been reporting to Manila through a contact in the Filipino underground who brings supplies to the camp kitchen." Chen's eyes were steady, sincere. "I've been covering for you. The Japanese suspect something, but I've been pointing them in wrong directions. You need to trust me now, because your timetable just collapsed. The Japanese received orders this morning to evacuate this camp in 72 hours. Evacuate means execute. They're not transporting prisoners, they're eliminating evidence." Mac's world tilted. Everything they'd built, all the careful planning, suddenly became inadequate. 72 hours. "Can you get a message out through your contact?" Mac asked. "I can, but it'll take 12 hours minimum for a response. What do you need?" "Tell them we're transmitting our coordinates tomorrow night at 2200 hours. Tell them we're breaking out immediately after. And tell them if they want intelligence about Japanese positions in these mountains, they better have someone listening." Chen nodded once. "Consider it done. And Captain, that radio you built, naval intelligence is going to want to see it. If we survive," Mac said, "they're welcome to it." The final preparations unfolded with desperate precision. They had 24 hours before transmission, 48 hours before the scheduled Japanese evacuation. Every decision now carried the weight of survival. Mac sketched the escape plan on a piece of cloth that could be quickly destroyed. They would move in 3 groups. Mac and Bob would handle the radio transmission from the edge of the camp perimeter, near the fence line where signal strength would be strongest. Eddie and Tommy would lead the first wave of prisoners through a weakened section of fence Tommy had been preparing. Chen would coordinate a diversion with other prisoners, creating chaos that would draw guards away from the escape route. "We can't take everyone," Bob said, the words bitter in his mouth. 42 men moving through jungle. We'll be spotted immediately." "No," Mac agreed, "but we can take 20. The strongest, the ones most likely to survive the trek. The others," he couldn't finish. The moral weight was crushing. Eddie volunteered to approach the men not selected, to explain the impossible choice. Some accepted with resignation, others with anger. Private Morrison, too sick with dysentery to travel, grabbed Mac's arm with surprising strength. "You go, Captain. You get out and you bring back help for the rest of us. That's an order, even though I got no authority to give it." The radio's final configuration required ingenuity bordering on insanity. They had no proper transmitter circuit, so Mac jury-rigged a solution. They'd use the receiver's local oscillator as a crude transmitter, modulating the signal by manually keying the power supply. It would produce a weak, unstable signal, but it would be detectable by anyone listening on the right frequency. Bob calculated their best frequency, 6240 kHz, a band commonly monitored by Allied forces in the Pacific. They'd transmit in Morse code. Simple, clear, impossible to mistake. Camp Hawthorne, American POW, 300 prisoners, Japanese evacuating, coordinates follow. Then the latitude and longitude Eddie had painstakingly calculated using astronomical observations and stolen Japanese maps. Tommy prepared their emergency supplies, water in stolen canteens, rice balls hidden over weeks, basic first aid materials, a single stolen pistol with 3 bullets, symbolic more than practical. Eddie translated Japanese evacuation orders he'd seen, mapping the likely routes guards would use, identifying gaps in coverage. As night fell on September 29, 1944, 20 American prisoners prepared to bet their lives on a radio built from garbage and maintained hope. The Japanese guards had no idea their perfect order was about to shatter. At 21:45 hours, Mac and Bob crawled through the darkness toward their transmission point. The monsoon clouds provided cover, blotting out starlight, turning the world into varying shades of black. They moved slowly, painfully, every sound amplified by adrenaline and fear. Behind them, Chen's diversion kicked off precisely at 2200 hours. A staged fight between prisoners erupted near the barracks, drawing guards from their positions. Sergeant Ishida rushed toward the commotion, exactly as predicted. Corporal Sato followed, leaving the eastern fence line minimally guarded. Mac and Bob reached their position, a small depression near the fence concealed by overgrown vegetation. Mac unwrapped the radio, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the physical toll of malnutrition and stress. Bob extended the antenna wire, a crude affair that might barely work. "Battery's weak," Bob whispered, checking the stolen unit with a homemade tester. "We'll get maybe 5 minutes of transmission time. Then we better make them count." At exactly 2200 hours, Mac keyed the transmitter. The oscillator hummed. Would it be enough? Bob adjusted tuning, searching for resonance, for any indication their signal was radiating into the night sky. Then Mac began tapping. "Camp Hawthorne, American POW, 300 prisoners, Japanese evacuating." Seconds became eternities. Each Morse character was a bet against silence. Mac transmitted the coordinates Eddie had calculated, repeated them twice for clarity, then added, "Breaking out tonight. Need immediate extraction." A flashlight beam swept across the compound. Guards were becoming suspicious despite the diversion. "We need to go," Bob hissed. Mac transmitted one final sequence, "God bless America." Then he ripped the antenna wire free, grabbed the radio, and they scrambled back toward the fence line. Tommy was waiting with wire cutters he'd fabricated from stolen materials. The fence parted with surprising ease. He'd been working on this section for weeks, weakening welds, loosening posts. 20 men slipped through the gap in less than 3 minutes. A miracle of coordination born from desperation. Behind them, the camp erupted. Guards shouted, searchlights blazed, shots fired into the air. But the prisoners were already melting into the jungle, splitting into prearranged groups, moving along routes Eddie had memorized from his intelligence gathering. Mac clutched the radio against his chest as he ran. Evidence. Proof. A testament to American ingenuity that he'd be damned if he'd leave behind. The escape had begun. Now came the impossible part. Survival. The jungle was a living nightmare, thick, disorienting, filled with sounds that could be insects or soldiers. Mac's group consisted of 5 men, himself, Bob, Eddie, Tommy, and Private Jackson, a former Boy Scout, whose wilderness survival knowledge suddenly became their most valuable asset. They moved northeast away from obvious routes, gambling that the Japanese would expect escapees to head south toward Leyte, where Allied forces were rumored to be landing. Instead, they pushed into deeper jungle, toward mountain areas where Filipino guerrillas were known to operate. By dawn, they'd covered maybe 6 kilometers. Exhaustion hit like a physical blow. Men who'd been starving for months couldn't sustain the pace. They found a small cave, concealed by vegetation, and collapsed. "Did anyone hear our transmission?" Tommy asked, the question everyone was thinking. "No way to know," Mac admitted. "Best case, someone's triangulating our position right now. Worst case, we're on our own." Back at Camp Hawthorne, chaos reigned. Colonel Yamamoto interrogated prisoners with increasing violence, trying to determine how many had escaped, who had planned it, what resources they'd used. The remaining POWs maintained discipline. Nobody knew anything. Nobody saw anything. The solidarity was beautiful and heartbreaking. These men were protecting escapees they might never see again. It was Sergeant Ishida who discovered the radio. Searching barracks. 7 systematically, he noticed the hollow post. Inside, he found wire remnants, a few components Mac had been forced to leave behind in the rushed escape. Ishida showed his discovery to Colonel Yamamoto, whose face went through a progression of emotions, confusion, realization, then something approaching respect. "They built a radio?" Yamamoto said in Japanese, examining the evidence. "From this?" A Japanese signals officer was brought in to examine the components. His assessment was grudging. Whoever built this understood radio theory at an advanced level. This is not amateur work, these were skilled engineers. The realization sent shockwaves through the camp command. The Americans weren't just prisoners. They were intelligent, resourceful adversaries who'd been underestimated. The radio represented a psychological victory even if the escape failed. Proof that captured didn't mean conquered, that imprisonment couldn't kill ingenuity. In the jungle, Mac's group heard distant helicopter sounds the following afternoon. American helicopters. The transmission had been received. Rescue was coming. They'd gambled everything on a radio built from scrap, and somehow, impossibly, they'd won. The rescue came at dawn on October 2, 1944. American OSS operatives working with Filipino guerrillas had triangulated the transmission and organized an emergency extraction. 2 Sikorsky R-4 helicopters, some of the first used in combat rescue, descended into a clearing Mac's group had reached after 3 days of brutal jungle trekking. But they weren't alone. A Japanese patrol had been tracking them, closing the distance through the night. As the helicopters landed, rifle fire erupted from the tree line. "Go! Go!" Mac shouted, pushing Tommy toward the first helicopter. Bob and Eddie provided covering fire with the single stolen pistol and rocks, anything to create confusion. Private Jackson took a round in the shoulder, but kept moving. The first helicopter lifted off with 10 rescued men, including Tommy, whose tears mixed with rain as he looked back at those still on the ground. The second helicopter had room for 8. 12 men remained. Mac made the calculation in a heartbeat. He thrust the radio, still wrapped in canvas, still intact, into Bob's arms. "Get this to Naval Intelligence. Tell them how we did it. Someone needs to know." "Captain, no." "That's an order, Lieutenant." Mac's voice was steel. "You've got a wife and kid. I don't. You're going home." Eddie and 4 others joined Bob in the helicopter. Mac and 5 men, including Chen, stayed behind to delay the Japanese patrol, firing from behind jungle cover, using guerrilla tactics that gave the helicopters precious seconds to escape. The firefight was brief and brutal. Mac took rounds in the leg and chest. Chen dragged him behind a fallen log, applying pressure to wounds that were clearly mortal. "The radio worked," Chen said, his voice urgent. "They heard us. Hundreds are being rescued because of what you built." Mac smiled through blood-stained teeth. "Good. That's good." He died there in the Philippine jungle, holding a rifle he'd taken from a fallen Japanese soldier. But his death bought time. Enough time for the helicopters to escape, enough time for Bob to deliver the radio, enough time for Camp Hawthorne's remaining prisoners to be liberated by advancing American forces 6 days later. The radio that shouldn't have worked changed everything, and the Japanese guards, discovering its full sophistication later, could only shake their heads in shocked admiration. The radio Captain James McAllister built from scrap metal is now displayed at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. Preserved in a climate-controlled case, its crude components tell a story more powerful than any propaganda poster: American ingenuity, determination, and refusal to surrender even in the darkest circumstances. Lieutenant Bob Hartley returned to his farm in Iowa and his wife Mary, meeting his daughter Sarah for the first time in 1945. He never spoke publicly about the escape until 1972, when he testified before a congressional committee about POW treatment. He described Mac's sacrifice, the radio's construction, and the impossible courage of men who refused to die quietly. Bob passed away in 1998, requesting burial with the circuit diagram he'd memorized during captivity, the blueprint of their salvation. Sergeant Eddie Nakamura faced a different homecoming. Despite his heroism, he returned to an America still suspicious of Japanese Americans. He worked as a radio engineer for Motorola, never receiving public recognition for his role in the escape until a 1990s investigation by military historians uncovered classified OSS reports. His intelligence gathering had saved not just Mac's group, but provided crucial information about Japanese positions that aided MacArthur's advance. He died in 2003, finally acknowledged as the hero he'd always been. Private First Class Tommy O'Brien became a mechanical engineer, designing aircraft systems for Grumman. He married, raised 4 children, and told them stories about Uncle Mac, the captain who'd saved his life, and taught him that ingenuity beats brutality. Tommy's testimony helped convict several Japanese war criminals at the Tokyo trials, his memory for detail proving crucial for justice. Lieutenant Commander David Chen continued intelligence work after the war, eventually becoming a senior analyst at the CIA. His role in facilitating the escape remained classified until 2010. When declassified documents revealed his extraordinary courage in operating behind enemy lines. The radio represented more than escape. It symbolized resistance, the human spirit's refusal to be broken by cruelty and captivity. Japanese guards who examined it after the escape reported their shocked admiration to superiors. Some of those reports survived the war, preserved in archives that historians would later discover. Captain James McAllister died in the jungle, but his legacy lived in every freed prisoner, every grateful family, Every engineer who heard the story and learned that impossible is just another engineering problem waiting to be solved. The cost of war is measured in lives lost and futures stolen. But the triumph of the human spirit, the refusal to accept defeat, the determination to fight with brains when weapons aren't available, that triumph echoes across generations. The radio built from scrap metal proved a simple truth. You can imprison the body, but you cannot cage ingenuity. You can guard the walls, but you cannot stop the human mind from building bridges to freedom.